Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to cover multiple topics. The first one's going to be the announcement on the start of the Kajaran and Sisian highway. Then we're going to move on to the current political crisis in our neighboring nation of Georgia. And then we're going to close with some comments about the collapse of the Assad dynasty this week. A few weeks ago, the national government in Armenia announced the final funding plan for the long-discussed Kajaran to Sisian highway and road and tunnel system, which is actually a key in making the north-south highway work. If anybody who doesn't know what that is, that's essentially the track that's going to bring in goods from Asia and India through Iran, through Sunik, through Georgia, and to the Black Sea into Europe. The Armenian government will take a €236 million loan from the European Investment Bank for the construction of the Sisian-Kajaran section of the north-south road corridor. The 60-kilometer section will include the construction of 27 bridges with a length of 4.7 kilometers, 9 tunnels with a total length of 12.5 kilometers, the longest of which is 8.6 kilometers. The construction of this section of the road will reduce the length of the current road by 54 kilometers, which in turn will reduce the driving duration by 1.5 to 2 hours. The average traffic speed after that, which is currently in the 50 kilometers per hour, will actually become 100 kilometers per hour. The rest of the funding for this project is going to come from the Armenian national budget and from further loans from the Asian Development Bank. The construction is expected to be finished in 2031. In analyzing this is actually an exceptionally good development, and frankly, this is something that should have been done years ago. And what's interesting about it is really one of the things that we have not done enough in Armenia since independence is essentially large infrastructure projects, and this is actually a very good example of that. And there's also a secondary national security component here, is because of cutting down driving time to Sunik actually and having safer and better roads. In case of an attack or invasion on Sunik, it makes it much easier to reinforce forces there to defend that region. Now we're going to move on to the second topic, which is the political crisis in Georgia, which is an after effect of the elections there. We wanted to give it a couple of weeks because there's obviously a lot of developments going on there to have more of a perspective. It's obvious that there were a significant fraud that affected the outcome of the elections. But it's also clear that the government party in power, Georgian Dream, actually has a base, not a majority, but a base in the country that, for our comparative terms, is much wider than, for example, the pre-revolutionary Sarkisian government. What has happened in the last couple of weeks, the opposition has refused to take their seats because they do not believe that the election was legitimate. The president, who is with the opposition, is refusing to leave her office. Much is made of this idea that the Georgian Dream is actually a tool of the Russian state and is aligned with Russia. And there's definitely certain elements of truth, but that is very clear that the Kremlin would want the Georgian Dream to stay in power. But there's also a very distinct internal play here, which is if you look at the model, the real model for the Georgian Dream party, the party of power, is actually not Putin, is actually Viktor Orban. Because what they want to do is they want to create the pseudo-democracy in which you actually have elections, but the ruling party can never lose. As the system becomes more corrupt and it becomes more oligarchic and essentially steps away from moving towards democratic norms. When you're looking at the current crisis, this was sort of what triggered the current crisis and the mass demonstrations that we've had is the government announcing that they're actually freezing the process negotiations with the EU to join the EU. And this is after the EU itself had actually frozen this process on its own. So I don't know why they even made that announcement, because it was sort of an unnecessary stab at the opposition to activate a lot of people that normally wouldn't have been active. And this has actually led to massive demonstrations in all over the country, actually, not just in Tbilisi. There's been mass violence. There's obviously non-state actors, thugs that have been brought in by the ruling government to beat people up on the street. What we've seen over the last few days is actually after the massive state violence, you've had less activity on the streets and demonstrations. And if you look at the analysis of what the government is saying. They sort of have this Trump savior factor in which they keep talking about that once the current American administration is out and Donald Trump takes over, they will understand what we're trying to do and we can essentially continue ruling as we are. I am not sure if that is actually the case. In analyzing this, given how pro-European essentially the totality of Georgian society is, to the extent that even the current government actually ran as a pro-EU party, they're going to have a hard time keeping the current stance. What is likely to happen is that slowly the current government is going to be slowly squeezed by the United States and the EU, and they will essentially be squeezed out of the favorable treatment that they've had over the past 20 years in funding and half a dozen different other things. Individuals will begin to be sanctioned by different Western governments or by the EU or the United States, and that's already happening. And at some point that will extend to the country or the primary institutions of the country. They will be slowly marginalized until the current government falls. As far as Armenian-Georgian relations, I really don't expect much to change because regardless of governments here or there, we generally have two friendly countries that have had relations with each other for hundreds or thousands of years. The likely government, especially if things are going badly for the current government, if they actually stay in power, they will actually need the good offices and the good graces of the Armenian government, which at this point has a much better relationship with the West than they do. And all of this obviously leads to one of the primary security issues, which is the continuous supply of Western weapons that come through Georgia, which were blocked for a long time until they were opened about a year and a half ago. Now we have a completely unimpeded supply of weapons coming in from around the world. In conclusion, this week, I wanted to close with a few comments on the collapse of the Assad government in Syria, which is obviously the big story dominating the world this week. There's actually important lessons for us in learning from what happened in the last few days, and in fact, what's been going on for almost more than a decade. The first lesson is you do not allow your country to become a pawn in the interests of others. Here we're looking at Syria, in which every Syrian faction is simply a front, either for Turkey, for the United States, for Iran, for Russia, or Israel, or whoever. And what is pathetic is this is the second most important country historically in the Arab world, and the Arab world almost has no say in what goes on in that country. Obviously, what I mean by this is not that you don't have relations with the world when you're a small country like ours. You actually have to be integrated into different blocks and into working with much bigger countries than yours, but you also always have to know what your interests are and pursue those interests within the guideline of working with other people. The other point is we see how the Russians acted here. They either didn't have the capacity to defend the Assad regime, or they made some sordid deal with the Turks to actually sell him out. Either way, it means that they're frankly worthless when it comes to security purposes. And regionally, what we saw in the last 2 weeks in Syria and in Damascus is actually the eventual fate of the regime in Baku, which, by the way, after the fall of the Assads, now the Aliyevs, are actually after the Kims in North Korea, the longest running political dynasty in the world. Every dictator, like every dog, has his day. Everything we do as a state and a nation is frankly a preparation for that moment. Thank you for joining me this week's episode of Insights.
When I awoke, I discovered the fragility of my dream. There was no moon in the skies of Jericho. There were no fish in the waters of the Euphrates, and no coffee in Aden. I saw Arabism displayed at the antique auction house, but I did not see the Arabs. When the drawing ended, I asked myself, if one day they announce the death of the Arabs, in which cemetery will they be buried? Who will cry for them? They don't have daughters, and have no sons, and there's no sadness, and there's no one to mourn.
من يحتمون